1957. Deep in the Arkhangelsk region of northern Russia, in a sparsely populated area with a treacherous, inhospitable landscape, the Soviets were hiding a secret from the world. A secret so well protected that even the local inhabitants didn't know what was going on. Convoys of transport vehicles closed roads. By day, silent armies moved in. By night, the skies rumbled and flashed. The farmers who lived nearby whispered amongst themselves about the bizarre swirl of activities, but they knew better than to ask what was happening to their once humble community. The Cold War was as icy and dangerous as the rugged homeland that had once been theirs alone, and people who probed into its secrets often disappeared without trace. The secret that the Soviets kept so well hidden in northern Russia was not a new rocket or a deadly missile. It was much bigger. Not only was there an immense launch site, the Soviets had also built a huge nearby city housing thousands of families. Despite the middle-class amenities, all of the residents were here to serve one deadly purpose: to plot the Cold War's military contingencies, including the destruction of the United States. Public relations aside, the final frontier has always been about weaponry. Whoever dominates Earth's orbit maintains the ultimate global military position. For two clashing superpowers battling for control of the world, space was just the latest theater of the Cold War, the front lines in a battle of brinkmanship that brought mankind perilously close to extinction. Long hidden from view, the Soviets' most tightly held space secrets can now be revealed. It's a history closer to science fiction than we could ever have imagined. Now we can finally explore the true stories of killer satellites, invisible cities, and spies in the sky, as we peer into the never-before-seen world of secret space. By the late 40s and early 50s, the United States and Soviet Union were both frantically working on new delivery systems for their nuclear warheads. While the US had the capability of bombing the Soviet Union, the Soviets felt threatened because they had no bombers within striking range of America. Rockets were the armaments of the future. The problem was how to develop enough thrust to carry a sufficient payload. Two different approaches were in development. Ballistic missiles called for a multi-stage rocket delivery system. Intercontinental cruise missiles called for the development of a large booster capable of launching a jet-propelled missile. In 1953, the Soviets gave their top jet team responsibility for development of a rocket-boosted supersonic intercontinental cruise missile called Burya. The first successful launch of Burya occurred in total secrecy. There would be a significant number of test firings, and it wasn't always a smooth road. But the project served to heighten American concerns. Despite its successes, the Buria program was seen as being more vulnerable to defense systems and was discontinued in favor of conventional ICBMs. Because technological developments were such an important part in the escalating battle for military advantage, secrecy was paramount. With the great advances in surveillance techniques, all operations went covert. The heavy cloak of the Iron Curtain excelled at keeping the West in the dark. The Soviets took this concept to its extreme with the development of secret space cities. Since the shortest trajectory for attack would go over the North Pole, the Soviets needed to construct a launch site as far north as possible. In 1957, the Central Committee decided to build Destination Angara, a highly classified launch site which could dispatch nuclear warheads over the Arctic Ocean towards North America. It would come to be known as Plisetsk. East of the base, military construction workers broke ground on a top-secret residential area that they named Mieny, Russian for peaceful.
At the time, the idea was to locate the city deep inside the forest, secretly, like during the war. But our commander said, "What are we supposed to do? Hide the cosmodrome? That's impossible."
When Vladimir Ivanov arrived at Plisetsk, the young lieutenant was immediately put to work.
I came here on New Year's Eve of 1959. It was a busy time, construction everywhere. And a major met us and said, "Now your uniforms are work clothes. Get in the mud and start digging."
Local villagers had a good sense of what was behind the flurry of activity. By 1959, the first ICBM was ready for duty, and it was all secret.
Что там строят? Ну, это такое общее предположение, что строят военные.
Whenever something was under construction, we assumed that the military was building it. And it's something secret.
Никто, как говорится, никакого секрета, ничего.
Of course, when the road was built, that couldn't be kept secret. It was obvious. But why and for what, we didn't need to know.
Что-то военное. А потом уже после, конечно, что там ракеты, что это, ясно, что
Sure,
знали.
something military. Later we knew it was rockets or other things for defense. Sure, we knew, for defense. It was necessary.
The United States had suspicions about covert activity in Plisetsk, but they had no proof. As eager as the Americans were to find out what was going on in northern Russia, the Soviets were fervently trying to keep it covered. In 1960, US reconnaissance tried but failed to document what was going on at Plisetsk. The only solid evidence they had was a low-quality aerial image of new railway lines feeding into the area. Then, in 1961, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a top CIA mole, Soviet Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, revealed the existence of this top-secret range with ICBMs at launch-ready status. It was Plisetsk.
In the Soviet Union, it was the fear on the beginning that at last Americans will discover how weak we are, and then it can push them to begin the war, will trigger the war.
As the evidence came in first from the U-2 flights and then from the Corona reconnaissance satellites, that there were not substantial numbers of weapon systems deployed, particularly ICBMs. That the U.S. leadership was a little surprised. We were able to back off of the plans to build thousands of missiles to maintain a strategic balance.
Now that the Soviets knew that their secret had been discovered, they changed their objectives at Plisetsk. The warheads were moved to other locations, and in their place, space activity grew. Despite this change in focus, the launch facility would remain a closely guarded secret. Soon, Plisetsk would become the Soviets' busiest space center. The mud huts and barracks of the battle-duty soldiers were being replaced by a bustling city. In 1966, the first satellite was launched from here, Cosmos 112. More than half of the Soviets' launches to date have been fired from Plisetsk. It wasn't until 1983 that the Soviets officially acknowledged the base at Plisetsk. In 1989, the first Western reporters were allowed to roam within its once secret borders. 30 years earlier, they would have been shot with no questions asked. For in the midst of the Cold War, secrecy was a powerful weapon, a necessary accomplice to the military's perilous plans. Plans that, once revealed, would send a collective chill down the spines of the entire free world. Buried deep within a labyrinth of corridors and heavy doors, the Soviet military labored endlessly to stay ahead of its enemies. One of their top designers was seen here in a rare archival interview.
One of the problems we worked on deserves special attention. This was the problem everyone worried about, the problem of maintaining the strategic balance to prevent a global nuclear war. This problem was the main concern from the time of the first A-bomb. We designers made a lot of different weapons with the concern not of how they would be used, but of how to prevent them from ever being used.
With the key already inserted in the logic locks of both NATO and Soviet missile commands, mankind could be wiped out in a matter of minutes. Both sides of the conflict sought an effective deterrent against the impending Armageddon. Science was the first line of defense. The military exploitation of space had started. Foremost in that effort was the use of reconnaissance satellites. Both nations planned to send manned military space stations into orbit. While advances in robotic satellites led the US to cancel its program, the Soviet Union continued theirs. They would send space stations into orbit, equip them with state-of-the-art surveillance, and launch soldiers into space to operate them.
They were manned by 2 cosmonauts, and they had a very powerful telescope with a photo camera aboard. It was considered that the pilots would provide the more accurate assessment of the targets, assessment of the photographed area.
Every attempt was made to hide these secret news stations by launching them under the same designation as the civilian Salyuts. But the assumed name didn't fool anyone in the intelligence community. These Almaz space stations flew at a radically lower orbit. Their primary objective was obvious: to spy on the rest of the world. In this exclusive 1994 interview, cosmonaut Viktor Gorbatko provides the first view of this military space station ever seen.
We are not in a mock-up, but in a real Almaz that was under preparation for launch. Now we are coming to the main place for station command and control. As you see, there is a globe to understand the orbit, big panel on the left and further, So many different control systems to feel the station.
The Almaz carried powerful photo equipment for detailed reconnaissance work. It also carried precise targeting equipment for locating areas for surveillance.
Доворачивали станцию, вот вы видите, на экране мы видим тоже, где мы пролетаем, какая местность и какой у нас крен.
We were looking at the Earth, and at the proper moment we oriented the station to a certain direction. Then we switched the zoom and took a picture with the Agat camera.
In all, 3 Almaz stations were sent into orbit, and crews worked on them during the mid-1970s.
Система «Алмаз» это была действительно отличнейшая система,
The system Almaz was a very good system, not at all similar to the Salyut station. It was created purposefully with a great variety of instrumentation for the management of many types of investigations.
As Vladimir Shatilov knew, the advantages of having live technicians were mitigated by their human frailties. For one thing, the men aboard were given a grueling schedule.
These inverted schedules, this necessity to sleep 2 hours and then to work 4 in order to see the side of the Earth where the USA is, and the other things which interested us, it all exhausted the crew.
Because of the sensitive nature of these missions, much of it was highly classified. This didn't prevent the space community from speculating about anomalies, especially in regard to one bizarre and harrowing mission. Soyuz 21 successfully docked with the Salyut 5 space station. Observers were shocked when the mission was abruptly terminated. An official report blamed the aborted mission on an acrid odor in the station's atmosphere. Cosmonaut Vitaly Zolobov was behaving erratically. Finally, mission control psychologists convinced the authorities to cease the mission.
Это хронический стресс.
Rostislav Bogdashevsky, now the chief psychologist at Star City, was a member of the support group.
It was chronic emotional stress and a disturbance in the ability to process information. This was caused by sensory deprivation and the mission's demanding schedule.
The audio tape of Zolobov's descent into madness has never been released. Officials claim it was erased. Ultimately, advances in computer technology meant that no satellites would ever again have to rely on human components.
Progress in automated spy satellites was so great that eventually it was considered in both countries, in the United States and the Soviet Union, that it didn't worth it to launch pilots to the reconnaissance missions.
While satellite technology was exploited for military advantage, it also provided some stability. This new information served to calm Cold War fears. Nations now had the ability to accurately measure the military capacity of their enemies. Treaties could be verified, violations pointed out, and while this information couldn't reveal a country's intentions, it provided a degree of reassurance in a very dangerous world.
What these satellites did was create a true revolution in the history of the world. They made arms control possible. They gave us enough intelligence so that we knew whether or not there was going to be a very serious confrontation and possible war with the Russians. We knew that if a war started, both sides were going to get obliterated. And with the exception of a few really, truly hardcore screwballs on both sides, that was a very, very stabilizing influence.
While international talks and verifications inspired hope for peaceful coexistence, the Soviets remained cautious of any possible American advantage. US superiority in nuclear-armed submarines was particularly worrying to them. They responded by developing their top-secret rocket strike warning system, SPRN. This was a network of various global surveillance systems. The first system involved continuous monitoring of missile launches. Using remote, infrared sensors in space, the Soviets could detect the hot exhaust of missiles. Konstantin Vlasko-Vlasov was a leading satellite designer. Through his efforts, the Soviets could see exactly what was happening, anywhere in the world.
We followed events and knew what was going on. We know where the ranges are and the regions with dangerous missile capabilities. We see globally. In fact, if someone goes mad and takes an action, even in this case we are safe. Other means are immediately brought to combat readiness, and they provide protection of our country from such unexpected events.
The system, once brought to readiness, provided for detection and protection from falling warheads. Similar to the American Patriot system, the Soviet S-300 anti-missiles could target and destroy incoming missiles. The early warning systems provided course and speed data. The anti-missile radar then picked up the target and launched a heat-seeking missile to intercept and terminate the aggressor. The Soviets also implemented a global observation system for monitoring aircraft, ships, and cargo vehicles. Sergei Mishukov developed systems to track US submarines.
To assess the situation, one had to know the position of ships at every moment. It is known that the latest agreements between Russia and the US envision a great part of US nuclear potential based on submarines.
Satellites became increasingly important to military command, control, and communications. As this happened, concerns about these satellites' safety evolved. Early outer space treaties were signed to keep space a safe haven from weapons deployment. But both sides realized the advantage of having the capacity to disable their opponent's key satellites. One aspect of the Soviet global protection system involved finding and destroying military objects in space.
Here the satellite flies. That is of interest to us. We must go to the place where it appeared and execute the needed operations. I must say that this is the only such system in the world. Nobody else possesses one.
These satellites are intended to decommission enemy reconnaissance vessels. The first testing of this system began in 1964. Through the 1970s, this system maintained a launch readiness of 90 minutes. In less than an hour after liftoff, the Soviet anti-satellite system could disable almost any targeted satellite. The US had the technology, but didn't develop a similar weapon.
We didn't go that route. You break into his uplink, his command system, and using his code, you tell his satellite to take the rest of the day off. That is the most effective kind of ASAT weapon, not blowing it to smithereens. Because he doesn't know whether his satellite is broken, whether you've got in, whether everything is really working anyway, and you've totally confused him and befuddled him. On war day, that's what you'd want to do.
Given the deadly consequences, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Agreement of 1972 was signed by both the US and Soviet Union to prohibit the development of space-based anti-missile systems. But neither nation was resting easy. During the Reagan administration, the Strategic Defense Initiative escalated the development of space-based weapons for both sides. This ended a self-imposed moratorium on Soviet development of the ASAT system. In the post-Cold War era, the threat of global annihilation has diminished. But satellites have become indispensable military tools, as designer Leonard Legozo explains.
Показывает, что одна из сторон, это был локальный, в общем-то, конфликт,
The experience of the Gulf, and it was essentially a local conflict, shows that effectiveness of the armed forces used there were positively augmented through using space systems of support. We believe that the role of space defense systems is now essential in all types of conflicts.
The frightening reality is that the world may now need these systems of advanced military detection more than ever. At least in the short term, the proliferation of nuclear weapons has intensified because of the lack of control over weapons in the former Soviet Union. Once a key's turn away from Armageddon, the deadly tension between the US and the Soviet Union is past. But the planet is still in danger from above. For circling over us now is, perhaps, the former Soviet Union's deadliest secret: radioactive satellites on a collision course for Earth. During the Cold War, space was the ultimate hiding place, a silent accomplice to both the US and the Soviet Union. Top-secret missions, prying satellites, and deadly cargo were all kept concealed in a hidden orbit around the Earth. But space can't harbor these secrets forever. The upper atmosphere is littered with the remains of past space missions and disabled satellites. As orbits become congested with more and more space junk, the danger of collision increases. Beckoned by the pull of gravity, other satellites will lose their orbits. In 1979, the American Skylab delivered the first widely heard warning from space as it fell towards Australia. Soviet space debris poses a much greater risk. Some of it is radioactive. The United States believes that the Soviet Union began launching naval spy satellites powered by nuclear reactors in 1967.
Because the satellites was flying very low, it couldn't be supplied with the solar batteries. That's why it was powered by the nuclear reactor.
And there was a general sense that was a bad thing to do, reinforced when one of them re-entered unexpectedly and landed in the Northern Territories in Canada and spread radioactive material over a pretty large area.
As it became evident that this satellite was coming down, Western governments pressed the Soviets for information.
Everybody were very nervous, and they asked what can happen. And at last they asked Mr. Bondaryuk, who was designer of this space atomic reactor.
The Soviet Central Committee compelled the designer to prepare a report, but it was never released to Western sources. Its contents were too unsettling.
He wrote a letter and he told nothing happened, but it is small probability if it will not burn during the landing, hitting the Earth. It's maybe small, not nuclear explosion at about 5 kiloton. 5 kiloton, it is half of Hiroshima bomb.
Not only was there no way of knowing what would happen when it crashed into the Earth, there was also no way of knowing where on Earth it would crash. This potential for disaster was terrifying. There was a collective sigh of relief as the debris rained down on a sparsely populated area of northern Canada without exploding. Government officials undertook the huge effort of locating and containing this contamination. While escaping the devastation of a nuclear explosion, there was still danger. Some of this debris was capable of delivering fatal doses of radiation within hours of exposure. The Canadian government engaged in a multi-million-dollar cleanup effort. The search area covered 65,000 square kilometers. It could have been much worse.
In fact, we were lucky that it didn't travel for another 10 or 15 minutes because that cloud of debris could fall downrange closer to more populated areas like Great Lakes or maybe even east coast of the United States.
These satellites were designed to jettison their nuclear reactors into high orbits when they began to fall. After the Canadian crash, the Soviets developed another safety system. This was put to the test when another satellite began to come down without first jettisoning its atomic reactor.
Instead of re-entering as a single piece with the nuclear materials protected inside of the high heat resistant reactor, it was separated into pieces.
This separation allowed the uranium and plutonium isotopes to be destroyed in the upper atmosphere and spread across a large territory. Once again, disaster was narrowly averted.
There are 36 nuclear reactor-powered satellites that were launched in this period. They still remain in these high orbits around the Earth. They have a lifetime of about, depending on what satellite it is, about 400 years. So in about 400 years, there's a lethal danger that these satellites will crash back to the Earth with their nuclear reactors, still not having exhausted their half-lives. So this is something that needs to be addressed eventually at some point by the people of this planet to prevent such disastrous calamities from occurring.
In such a high-stakes arena, radioactive spy satellites in low orbit were not judged by the potential danger they posed, but by the intelligence information they provided. But these episodes begged the obvious question: what can the world community do to eliminate the threat posed by this most deadly space debris? Thankfully, top designers are working to eliminate the threat of another nuclear crash.
Now we can begin cleaning space of debris. There are some highly dangerous objects that could be landed or moved into other orbits for thousands of years to come.
Every move in space was seen as a carefully planned, clandestine military move. And the American idea of a space shuttle was no different. The Soviets were suspicious of the combat capabilities of the shuttle. They could take no chances. They needed to respond in kind. The mission they undertook would be the grandest enterprise in Soviet space history. A spaceship designed under the highest degree of security. They called their shuttle Buran, and it was designed to be the ultimate counterweapon. In the 1970s, at their largest space range, Baikonur, the Soviets began work on a huge new project. A direct response to the perceived military threat of the American space shuttle, it was designed and constructed under the highest degree of secrecy. The Buran project was a huge undertaking. The massive technological demands and funding levels put a strain on limited Soviet resources. But the perceived threat of the American shuttle program was too great to ignore. The shuttle, engineers believed, was capable of swooping down from outer space, bombing enemy targets into oblivion and flying away. The Soviets had to respond in kind. Otherwise, they could be left defenseless to this superweapon. Like so many other Soviet engineers, Yuri Semyenov had a deep-seated fear of the shuttle's capabilities.
I remember very clearly lectures in the 1970s that proposed that the shuttle, while returning to Earth, could make a maneuver over Moscow and could do anything. So we felt that they were talking to us from a position of power.
In addition to a direct military threat, the shuttle was to be used to deploy and recover reconnaissance satellites. If it could recover its own satellites, it could also capture enemy satellites. The Soviets took this threat very seriously, as demonstrated by these remarks made during the first televised appearance in 1993 of Sergei Afanasyev, space industry minister for nearly 20 years. His comments give clear insight into both the Soviet sense of urgency as well as their motivational techniques.
Товарищ Афанасьев, на Совете обороны Брежнев сказал, он говорит, если мы
Comrade Afanasyev, Brezhnev said at a meeting of the Council of Defense,
Окажемся, понимаете, так сказать.
if we fail in this missile space business, the Americans will have the systems and we will not.
Комплексы, а мы нет, и мы будем
And if we lag behind them, we will shoot you.
The threat of death was pervasive, as immense security surrounded this covert project. As was the Soviet way, everything was kept secret, even the first transport of this enormous vessel. Early in the morning, under dark cover, the vehicle was transported from its plant. The citizens' only clue was the hasty widening of the street which had taken place just a few days before. The Buran was hailed as a technological achievement in space exploration. To navigate this mysterious craft became the foremost goal of every pilot in the Soviet space program. When the program was plagued with delays and uncertainty, these elite test pilots were offered cosmonaut jobs, but turned them down. Men like test pilot Alexei Borodai had a singular goal: to fly the brand new Soviet shuttle.
But we trusted in the Buran project. The dream of any test pilot is to fly new vehicles, and Buran, in this case, was a good vehicle for our job. What is the Soyuz spacecraft? It is not interesting for a test pilot. It is too simple.
Nearly a decade in the making, in December 1985, the newborn Buran was flown from its home to the Cosmodrome. It was a flight that nearly ended in disaster. Secrecy was strictly enforced, and a route planned and timed to avoid detection by American spy satellites. During the flight, one of the transport's engines malfunctioned and created a dangerous trail of fuel. The flight was made with the knowledge that this fuel could ignite at any time and quickly bring this journey to a horrific end. But they arrived safely. Now the Buran was ready for its final test. But despite the difficulty of getting to this point, the pride and confidence was palpable.
I believe that we were very late with this project. Too much to do. Too little money. I talked with the Minister of Finance many times. He would tell me, Afanasyev, we have to give so much to agriculture. Understand? But I would reply, listen, you have already invested so much in agriculture. With that money we would have many Burans ready to fly. I assure you, if you give us the funds, we will deliver. Buran will be built. The whole industrial complex of the country was being developed. How could we miss such an opportunity? If we did nothing, what situation would we find ourselves in?
For this enormous undertaking, many new facilities were constructed, as well as a new launch vehicle, the Energia. This huge booster would now carry the new Soviet dream. It's May 1987. Final checks are being made for the first flight of the largest booster in the world, the new Energia, carrying a military satellite. As this rare film shows, something goes wrong in the moments before the launch. There is a sudden wave of concern. It's discovered that no water is in the cooling deflector of the launch pad. Without it, the rocket ignition could cause a huge fire. But the general in charge of the flight, General Gudelian, proceeds. The Energia took flight, but not without difficulty. The vehicle tilted dangerously during the launch, but its computer quickly made a trajectory correction. because of the tilt, the exhaust flames were not directed into the fire trench. The launch pad was severely damaged. But the launch of the Energia rocket was a success. The booster had completed its first successful launch. All that remained for it now was to lift the Buran into orbit. On November the 15th, 1988, Buran was ready.
Когда я сидел на пуске на Буране, черт возьми, меня просто дрожь брала, потому что...
I was there during the launch, just trembling with excitement.
Секундами полета. Идет вообще, черт возьми, без сбоя вообще.
All the lights on the board light one by one without delay. I said, check it, maybe it isn't connected.
Мало ли что прыгает, понимаете. Прыгает этот черт с ним, понимаете. Надо посмотреть по параллельным схемам. Давайте. Они, значит, побежали, включили там параллельные схемы. Давайте. Все идет секунду в секунду.
You know, it seemed as though Buran was not in flight, just lights lighting one by one. Everything on schedule, as planned. No deviations. It was first time during all the launches.
Operating without a crew, the fully automated test of the Buran launched perfectly. As it flew 2 orbits, the Soviets were jubilant. Their space program was once again transporting them to the top of the world. A precision landing completed the success.
It was the pinnacle, the triumph of the manned space program, Energia in Buran. Despite what anyone may say, today we have a unique system, one that no other country possesses.
But that triumphant debut would turn out to be the Buran's swan song. What seemed like the beginning of a new chapter in the space race was actually the end of the story. Starting in 1989, funding for the Buran was dwindling. Another launch was scheduled for 1991, but the collapse of the Soviet Union dashed those plans. In the new Russia, economic concerns eclipsed the race for space. The Buran program was officially cancelled in 1993. As testimony to the 1990s changing priorities, Buran 2 and its Energia booster remain in an assembly hangar in Baikonur. Because it would cost more to take them apart than to launch them, the Soviets' grand achievement remains frozen in time. Like many of the accomplishments of the Soviet space program, the dream has been halted by the economic realities of the times. Like the old Soviet Union itself, this great behemoth, once frightening and awesome, has lost its bite. The most amazing accomplishment of the Soviet space program has now been reduced to exhibition status, an oddity to be gawped at. During the Cold War, the powerful and ominous Soviet Empire was built on a firm foundation of secrecy. Its strengths, weaknesses, insights and failures all entombed in an unyielding vault. Today, that vault is being opened, its mysteries disclosed. Secret space cities are no longer places where citizens get shot for asking questions. People are free to talk and speculate about what the future holds. And the world is now free to fully appreciate the wonders of Soviet space technology. From the futuristic design of the Buria missile to the development of state-of-the-art launch facilities and satellites, Soviet technology matched and even surpassed that of its Western foes. Now that the world is back from the brink of the Cold War and the fear of nuclear annihilation, space is once again a place of wonderment, scientific exploration, and hopefully progress for all humanity. But it is not without its mysteries even now. The territory that has become familiar is only a fraction of the dark, ominous galaxy that surrounds us. And the struggles of mankind, played out in the Earth's orbits, are only the edge of the fascinating world that is secret space.